Greetings, traveler of time. Let me take you far away, not just across lands, but through the centuries, into the heart of a small village in the 13th century, where the first stars flicker above thatched rooftops, and the cold mist begins to crawl up from the river. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Here, in this calm moment, the air carries the comforting scent of peat smoke, mingled with the heavy, earthy aroma of ground barley, a fragrance that defines survival for those who live off the land. It tells the story of a day ending and another about to begin with the same quiet persistence. Feel the damp coolness of the packed earth beneath bare feet, for life, even in its simplest form, has a complex texture, a mix of roughness and gentle hope that refuses to fade despite constant hardship. It's in this world of long shadows and heavy silences, broken only by the faint crackle of distant firewood, that we find young Clara, a peasant girl whose name echoes morning light, though her soul already knows the depth of sleepless nights. She's in the first bloom of adulthood, 20 years shaped by labor and routine, carrying the subtle weight of an uncertain future. Yet her brown eyes still hold a stubborn spark of determination. Before the rooster announces dawn, Clara moves through the dim cabin with the quiet grace of someone who doesn't want to wake her grandmother, Genevieve, a wise old woman resting in the corner, a living shrine of resilience and tradition. The cold, hard earthen floor grounds Clara to reality, reminding her that rest is brief and the day's essential work already waits, while outside the darkness still reigns, promising a frozen sunrise. The faint, flickering glow of an oil lamp falls on a rough wooden table, and the most crucial object of the morning, a dark lump of rye and barley dough that has been fermenting slowly overnight, covered by a coarse linen cloth. This is everything, their sustenance, their bread. For medieval peasants, bread wasn't just food, it was life itself, the tangible result of labor and the earth's blessing, the center of every meager meal. Clara's hand meets the cool, elastic dough, a familiar and comforting touch, almost alive. She begins kneading it slowly, rhythmically, shaping the formless mass into dense rounds, ready for the communal oven she'll light soon. The coarse grains of rye mix into the texture, and the smell deepens, a signal of life transforming under her hands. In the 13th century, grains were the lifeblood of Europe. For peasants like Clara, they made up about 70 to 80% of daily calories, a near-total dependence that tied survival to the whims of harvests and weather. Wheat, fine and costly, was a luxury reserved for nobles and the church, baked into pale loaves and delicate pastries. Common folk relied on rye, barley, millet and oats, humble but vital grains, resilient against the cold and poor soil. Clara's bread is dark, dense and heavy, often baked in clay ovens or directly on embers, its crust thick, its core compact, a sponge of fiber and strength, meant to endure long hours of work in the fields surrounding the village. For Clara, kneading bread is a silent meditation. Her thoughts blend with the calm rhythm of her hands as she works. She dreams of something beyond survival, a quiet longing she rarely dares to voice, a life where hunger isn't a constant guest, where the next harvest doesn't hang like a weight on her chest. Hunger in this time isn't a metaphor. It's a cycle, feared and familiar, worsened by floods, droughts, blight, or the ever-growing demands of feudal lords. Clara's desire mirrors that of her entire class, stability, enough to live without fear. She knows that true security doesn't lie in gold or privilege, but in knowledge, in the inherited wisdom of working the soil, a legacy she absorbs from her grandmother. As she shapes the last round loaves, Clara recalls something Genevieve once told her about the history of farming, how the introduction of the heavy plough and crop rotation changed everything. Those innovations allowed farmers to cultivate tougher land and boosted grain yields dramatically. Before that, fields were fragile and famines frequent. The new iron plough, drawn by oxen or horses, turned the soil deep, while the three-field rotation, winter grain, spring grain and fallow, kept the land fertile. It was a practical wisdom that offered a bit more food security for harsh seasons, though scarcity was never far away, always dependent on the mercy of weather and the moods of a capricious nature the villagers saw as divine. The quiet of dawn breaks with the creak of the wooden door. A breath of cold air slips in, followed by Etienne, an old grey-bearded farmer with calloused hands, come to start his own fire for the communal oven. It's a deeply rooted custom of cooperation, resources shared, labour divided, a necessity in a feudal world where survival depends on community more than individuality. Clara greets him with a silent nod, and he returns the gesture with quiet respect. The smell of burning peat begins to mingle with that of bread, creating the scent of simple, resigned life. Clara covers her shaped dough carefully with the cloth and prepares for the short walk to the oven, a small stone building in the village centre, usually owned by the local lord or the church. Each family paid a fee, the banalité, for the right to bake their bread there, a constant reminder of hierarchy and submission. Even the act of baking was taxed. Yet the oven was also a social space, a meeting point for women to exchange news and hopes before the long day in the fields scattered them again until dusk. As Clara walks along the muddy, narrow lane, the dew chills her bare feet awake. The village still sleeps under a heavy veil of fog, its few huts blurring together. But far away, the horizon starts to pale with the first light, a faint promise of dawn. A distant bell rings, the angelus from the nearby abbey, calling monks to prayer, a spiritual echo to Clara's own physical labour. It's a moment where dream and reality almost blend, and the only solid thing is the weight of dough in her hands, grounding her to purpose as she breathes in the cold, heavy air. At the oven, 3 other women wait, each silent, each with her own share of dough and her own story of struggle. Their exchanged glances form an unspoken language of understanding, a shared strength born from the same daily battles. Together, they move in rhythm, placing loaves on hot stones, stirring ashes, feeding the fire, with the precise economy of generations taught by need. The oven's warmth is a welcome refuge from the cold, a pulse of life at the village's heart. Soon, the smell of baking bread fills the air, the first announcement of a new day, the promise of strength. For medieval peasants, bread was rarely eaten alone. It came with componagium, literally what accompanies bread. It could be a pinch of salt, a bit of sour cheese, wild herbs, or on lucky days, a strip of bacon or an onion. Today, Clara's meal will be simple, a bowl of oat porridge and a few wild chard leaves gathered yesterday. Modest, yes, but deeply appreciated for breaking the monotony of grains and legumes that dominate their diet. As the heat builds, Clara watches the fire dance beneath the loaves, and her thoughts drift to Geneviève, the quiet keeper of their hope. Though age has weakened her body, the old woman possesses a wealth no lord can tax. Deep knowledge of herbs and wild greens, wisdom passed down through generations. Behind the cabin, Geneviève tends a tiny secret garden, a treasure of survival, her family's safeguard against scarcity. There she grows life itself, turning herbs and roots into flavor, nourishment, and healing. Geneviève once taught Clara the importance of legumes, peas, and broad beans, that peasants relied on not just for protein, but for soil enrichment. They restored nitrogen to the land, preparing it for the next grain crop. This practical wisdom, part science, part instinct, was the true backbone of medieval survival. The women of each generation didn't just feed their families, they fed the earth too. Thinking of her grandmother and that hidden garden, guarded with the devotion of a monk protecting his rarest manuscript, fills Clara with peace. She knows that their small plot of green, cultivated with love and cleverness, grants them a quiet dignity, a life slightly richer than those who depend solely on the Lord's fields. That patch of earth is rebellion disguised as routine, a quiet defiance against imposed scarcity. Each herb, each leaf, adds not only flavor to their soup, but meaning to their days. Though based mostly on grains, the peasant diet was often supplemented by vegetables, cultivated or wild, and by legumes, their main protein source, since meat was rare and reserved for the nobility. The daily potage, or soup, simmered for hours over low fire, thickened with oats, beans, or lentils, turning humble scraps into a warm, sustaining meal. This slow cooking created the heart of the medieval home, the one hot dish shared by all. The Middle Ages weren't a culinary dark age, as many believe. Despite scarcity, resourcefulness thrived. Common herbs, garlic, onion, mustard, sage, mint, and thyme, seasoned and preserved food and doubled as medicine. Geneviève was a master of such craft, knowing which root to use for fever and which leaf to add for depth of flavor. Feeding for her was an act of healing, a sacred inheritance passed from mother to daughter. Now, the smell of baked bread fills the village completely, rich and warm, the signal that morning has truly begun. Clara pulls her loaves from the oven, the crusts hard and crackling in the chill air. The dry sound of bread breaking is her reward, a crisp hymn to quiet endurance. Each loaf is heavy in her hands, dense with promise. Around her, the other women collect theirs, and one by one they disappear into the mist, each carrying home the day's sustenance. As Clara walks back, sunlight slices through the fog, revealing soft greens and gentle browns of the landscape. She thinks about the journey of bread, from seed to harvest, from mill to fire to table. It's a sacred cycle that binds heaven and earth, labor and grace. Every bite holds a lesson in humility and strength. At home, the warmth of the oven still clings to her palms. Geneviève is awake, sitting up with a faint smile. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the herbal fragrance of thyme leaves drying on the shelf. That scent is comfort itself, the assurance that another day can be faced. Clara prepares 2 bowls of oat porridge and sets them beside the bread. The first slice, as always, goes to her grandmother, a gesture of gratitude older than memory. They eat in silence, slowly, savouring the coarse bread and the warmth of the porridge. It isn't abundance, but it's enough. The rough texture of the bread reminds Clara that simplicity doesn't mean lack. It's the taste of earth. Barley, rye, wild herbs, pure and honest. It carries the raw dignity of labour. As warmth spreads through her body, she feels ready for the day. Before leaving for the fields, she pauses by the door, watching Geneviève step outside toward her hidden garden, slow but steady. There she'll tend to the leaves and roots that will season tonight's soup. Clara smiles. As long as her grandmother's hands can still nurture that secret green hope, hunger will always be held at bay. Heading to the fields, Clara reflects on how peasant life is a constant dance between necessity and desire, where necessity always wins. Food and warmth are the only true luxuries. The smell of damp earth greets her again, familiar, grounding, full of promise. The sun, now rising, warms her back, pushing her gently toward the day's work. The sky is clear now, filled with the sounds of life waking up. The bleating of sheep, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic thud of axes splitting wood. It's the music of survival, the heartbeat of the Middle Ages. Clara joins the other farmers. Together they work in silence, the steady pull of the plough marking the tempo of existence itself. She recalls something Geneviève once told her about medieval drink. Clean water was rare, often unsafe, so peasants, children included, drank weak ale or watered wine instead. Fermentation made these drinks safer, turning them into essential sources of calories and hydration. This liquid bread was a quiet triumph of ingenuity against poor sanitation, a way to keep the body strong for labor. As the plough digs through the heavy soil, Clara feels the sun's warmth grow. The morning chill fades. There's a calm in her heart, a sense that life's beauty lies not in plenty, but in the power to turn scarcity into sustenance, to find hope in simplicity. The image that stays with her is of Geneviève, bent over her secret garden, a silent guardian of green life in a brown, worn world. The plough's rhythm becomes a chant, the oxen's breath a steady drumbeat, the scent of turned earth the perfume of renewal. And with that quiet gratitude, the warmth of the sun, the promise of bread, the wisdom of those who came before, Clara carries on, knowing that every loaf of dark bread is a victory, and that the secret to survival lies in finding joy in the smallest things. Et avant Geneviève moves through her secret garden with a quiet reverence, as if handling something sacred, and she is, because here lie the keys to health and flavor that rarely reach a peasant's table. Her plot is a small rectangle of carefully tended soil, hidden behind a thick hedge of hawthorn. It holds not only the usual onions and garlic everyone grows, but a profusion of medicinal and culinary herbs she guards like a family secret. There's sage for the stomach, hyssop for coughs, and wild thyme to perfume the soup with a gentle touch, a palette of colors and scents that breaks the monotony of the open fields, a pocket of biodiversity and food resilience that Geneviève defends tooth and nail. This wisdom is her greatest wealth. The tiny space is a world of senses. The smell of damp earth blends with the pungency of rue and the cool freshness of mint. Geneviève's wrinkled fingers touch the leaves with a delicacy only age and experience can teach. Kneeling with effort, she gathers a handful of wild beet greens, an underrated plant she adds to oat porridge for a deeper, earthy taste and a vivid color, a small trick that turns the simplest dish into a more nourishing meal. Using what the land offers freely is a vital lesson she passes to Clara, showing that true survival is an art of keen observation and adaptability, and that nature, when respected and understood, always grants a little refuge. Peasant cooking in the Middle Ages, though focused on survival, wasn't without technique. Fermentation was essential, both for ale and for preserving vegetables. Geneviève keeps a clay pot buried in the ground where she pickles produce in brine, a simple but effective method that provides something fresh even during the leanest winter months. This skill of conservation, the art of saving summer, is precious knowledge she hands down to Clara, teaching that foresight and patience matter as much as physical strength in the fields. With them, tomorrow becomes a bit less uncertain than today. While she's still kneeling, the grandmother thinks of a telling detail about medieval scarcity, the absence of sugar and sweets in the peasant diet. Honey was the only sweetener, and costly, often reserved for the church or for medicine. For their rare desserts, usually stewed fruit or porridge, peasants relied on what nature offered, the natural sweetness of dried fruit when available, or sap from certain trees. Because everyday life lacked sweetness, the taste of a wild apple felt like treasure. Geneviève teaches Clara to appreciate the intrinsic flavor of each food, without masking it with expensive, unattainable ingredients. A lesson in moderation and contentment. Geneviève rises with a soft groan, her back protesting, but her eyes shine with the satisfaction of work well done. Her hands full of fragrant greens, she carries them into the cabin where the day's soup will begin. She lays the leaves on a rough wooden board and chops them with an iron knife, the crisp, steady rhythm echoing through the empty room, a sound Clara can practically hear from the fields. Preparing the soup, to be eaten with dark bread at night, is the day's quiet climax, the promise of warmth and togetherness waiting at the end of labor under sun and wind. Peasant soup, potage, is a symbol of resilience and creativity in hard times. It welcomes whatever can be found: salted pork bones, a luxury, turnips, cabbage, leeks, and the invaluable legumes, which Geneviève cooks until they nearly melt, thickening the broth and making it truly nourishing. That dense, hearty liquid is often poured over stale bread, which soaks up the moisture and flavor, wasting nothing. A way of life where each scrap matters. It's an ethic of preservation, essential to survival in uncertain times. Out in the fields, under a sun that grows stronger by the hour, Clara's thoughts turn to her grandmother and her knowledge. She realizes the family's greatest hope rests on Geneviève's gift for turning little into enough. The grandmother cultivates more than a garden. She cultivates ingenuity. This ability to make humble ingredients go further is the real inheritance she tries to pass on, a legacy of survival worth more than any property. The secret garden is a small manifesto against resignation, a place where imagination and know-how weave a richer reality despite the social and economic limits pressing in on them. Another lesson Geneviève shares is the importance of boiled water. Even though medieval folk didn't know the science behind it, following time-tested custom, she always boils the water for soup and porridge. Without realizing it, she kills many pathogens and makes meals safer, which means fewer illnesses and more days of work. A quiet, positive cycle that sets careful families apart. That simple practice, boiling water before drinking or cooking, stands as one of the village's pillars of health, a custom passed on by experience with life-saving results. Fieldwork is repetitive and exhausting, but Clara finds a rhythm, a cadence that matches the oxen's pace and the plough's pull. It becomes a moving meditation where the mind slips free of immediate worry and rests in the task at hand. The scent of freshly turned, moist earth is deep and intoxicating. The dirt that smudges her skin and wears her out is also what connects her to her true self, the self of a farmer bound to the seasons. The coarse ropes of the plough bite into her palms, a firm, steady feel that assures her of her strength and her ability to shape her future, even if slowly. At midday, with the sun high overhead, Clara breaks for a quick lunch. She sits in the shade of a centuries-old oak, where other peasants gather in silence, each with a portion of bread and componagium. The meal is brief and practical, fuel for the body. It's the same dark bread, drier now, with a few leftover spoonfuls of morning porridge wrapped in a cabbage leaf. The ritual is unassuming. Break bread, chew slowly, soak in the sun's warmth. It's a moment of quiet fellowship, where scarcity isn't lamented but accepted, and gratitude becomes the strongest seasoning. Geneviève insists that fruits and vegetables are more than flavor. They're the family's medicine. She tells Clara that winter often brought scurvy for lack of vitamin C, so it was vital to gather what nature provided: wild berries, blackberries, raspberries, bilberries, picked in summer, then dried or preserved for the cold months. This preventive wisdom is her greatest lesson, an empirical medicine of the poor that keeps bodies strong enough to withstand harsh weather and harder work. The afternoon drifts on, and the fieldwork continues with the same steady persistence, but Clara's mind turns to the future and to her grandmother's quiet plan to expand the garden not only for their own needs, but to help their neighbors. Despite her humble station, Geneviève believes community survival depends on solidarity and sharing, especially in hard times. A handful of herbs or a few seeds can be the difference between health and illness for someone nearby. True wealth isn't what you pile up, it's what you pass along. Clara recalls a story her grandmother told about food in medieval monasteries, true centers of agricultural knowledge and culinary innovation. The monks, though they followed strict rules of fasting and often vegetarian diets, refined techniques for cultivation, irrigation, wine, and ale. Their gardens were richer and more varied than those of common folk. That small historical contrast, monastic abundance versus peasant scarcity, reminded Clara that knowledge and organization can create plenty. It fuels her own quiet quest for a safer life. By late afternoon, fatigue sets in, but so does the satisfaction of a job done, the clean lines of ploughed furrows, a silent promise of harvest to come. Clara joins the line of peasants heading back to the village, her body sore but her spirit settled. The smell of hay and earth blends with the gentler scent of peat smoke rising from chimneys, the homeward fragrance of soup and rest. She thinks of the bread she baked in the morning, the center of everything, and how her life is measured by the grain cycle. Sowing, harvest, milling, bread, seed, over and over, the eternal return of peasant life. At the cabin door, the aroma of Genevieve's soup is rich and welcoming, garlic, onion, and a whisper of secret herbs from the garden. The grandmother sits near the gentle fire, stirring the pottage in a black iron pot hung over the hearth. The soft crackle of kindling is the night's lullaby. Heat from the flames, the burble of soup, and the scent of herbs weave a haven of peace, a tender contrast to the day's hard labor. Genevieve explains one of peasant cooking's quiet secrets, using vinegar and sour notes to lift flavor. Salt was dear, sweet spices out of reach, so a dash of vinegar, or lemon, when it could be had, played against the vegetable's natural sweetness, or the wine's roundness, creating a fuller, more satisfying taste. This simple art of brightening food with whatever was on hand shows once more her creativity, how necessity becomes craft. At last, the soup is ready. Genevieve ladles it into simple clay bowls, thick and steaming. Clara sits at the rough table, and a respectful hush settles in, a recognition of the moment's meaning, feeding the body for tomorrow's work, renewing the family bond that gathers here each night. Dark bread dips into the hot broth, soaking up the herbs and vegetables. Warmth spreads through Clara from within, a physical and quiet emotional comfort that smooths the day's edges. Her grandmother takes Clara's hand and reminds her of the garden's real secret. It nourishes not only the body, but the spirit. Tending life and watching it grow despite adversity is the wellspring of hope. True abundance isn't measured in quantity, but in gratitude. Love and generosity are the most important ingredients you can bring to any meal, turning dark bread and simple soup into a feast of peace and promise. Dinner ends in silence, the soft clink of clay bowls being cleaned and set aside. The day's weariness finally settles on Clara, and the hearth's warmth invites sleep. She lies down on the cot as the lingering scent of smoke and herbs becomes her last waking touchpoint, a perfume of home and safety that rocks her gently. Clara's final thought is a picture of her grandmother bent over the secret garden, the guardian of a small plot of resilience and hope. She knows that as long as there's dark bread and Genevieve's herbs, life, even a hard one, will always taste of promise and continuity. With the wind brushing softly against the wooden walls and the comforting breath of smoke in the air, Clara gives herself to sleep, wrapped in the serene calm of the medieval night. With the first light of morning spilling into the cabin, Clara wakes to the clammy chill seeping through the gaps in the wooden walls, a constant reminder of how fragile her shelter is against the elements. Her body, though rested, already carries the memory of yesterday's fatigue. The lingering scent of hearth smoke and baked bread still hangs in the air, now mingled with a fresher, earthier note she recognizes at once. Her grandmother, Genevieve, is brewing lemon balm from the garden, a soothing tea to calm the nerves and warm the stomach before the day's hard routine. The gentle burble of water in the iron pot hanging over the rekindled fire is the day's first symphony, a slow, comforting melody that sets the tempo of a life measured between labor and small, hard-won moments of peace. Clara rises and feels the rough wool of her homespun tunic against her skin, heavy, practical, and more protective than soft. She watches her grandmother sitting on the edge of the pallet, sipping the tea with ritual slowness, eyes resting on the steam unfurling from the clay bowl. The first element at the heart of this part of the story is fire, which for a medieval peasant is more than warmth. It's the house's true hearth, the center of social and culinary life, a small sun in a world of cold and dark. Fire transforms food, purifies water, and releases the stored energy of wood, the summer's light locked in bark and ring. It's the element that dictates domestic rhythms, especially through the long, punishing nights of the approaching winter. Under Genevieve's watch, the flames crackle quietly in the stone hearth. Clara lays a hand on the rough, cold mantle and leans in to feel the radiant heat. Welcome relief against the morning air. Her grandmother offers the clay bowl. Its warmth settles instantly into Clara's palms, and the lemon balm's sweet, calming fragrance rises with the steam, a soft promise of serenity amid routine. Genevieve explains that in the Middle Ages, knowledge of herbal infusions was crucial, basic preventive care and everyday medicine. Chamomile, elderflower, and other simples were as common as bread on the table, a modest pharmacopoeia that helped keep people relatively well. Clara drinks in small sips, savoring the tea's gentle sweetness and the spreading warmth down her throat. She listens as her grandmother speaks about light and heat in medieval homes. Though vital, the hearth was strikingly inefficient. Most peasant cabins lacked proper chimneys, so smoke filled the room and drifted out through a roof opening or the door. It left soot on the walls and a constant smoky scent clinging to clothes and hair, an indelible mark of social condition and a life adapted to limited means. This knowledge doesn't sadden Clara. It deepens her admiration for her people's resilience, and for her grandmother in particular, who's managed to turn a place of scarcity into a welcoming home. The glow of the flames, the quiet dance of light, the smell of burning wood, together they create belonging and safety, a small refuge from the feudal world outside, cold and demanding. For Clara, the ribbon of smoke escaping through the roof is a sign of life and struggle, the visible proof that the inner fire, hope itself, is still burning, holding the family together and warm. Seeing her granddaughter's eyes fixed on the flames, Genevieve shares a gentle household secret, one tied to water itself. Long before ale and wine spread widely, drinking from rivers and wells was even riskier, so folk wisdom taught filtering water through layers of sand and charcoal before cooking with it. Crude as it was, the practice removed visible impurities and improved taste, a family technique of purification she guards with care. Ancestral knowledge is her true wealth, the immaterial inheritance she offers Clara as her most precious gift. From that small secret flows a deeper calm. Survival depends not only on strength, but on quiet intelligence and a knack for using nature's resources wisely. The grandmother insists peasant food is, first and foremost, about safety and honest flavor found in simplicity, knowing which herb is poisonous, which root is nourishing, and how to keep the little they harvest, all pillars of their existence. She spends the morning teaching Clara about edible mushrooms in the forest, the kind of knowledge that can stand between a humble feast and illness. Genevieve takes one of yesterday's dark loaves and slices it. The crisp crack of the crust rings bright in the quiet, and the rye and barley aroma, faded overnight, blooms back into the air. She rubs a clove of garden garlic on a thick slice, a simple luxury that sharpens the bread's earthy taste with a faint, lively bite. Smell is the keenest sense now, smoke, herbs and grain, an olfactory memory of home that Clara will carry into the fields, a fragrance of subsistence and gentle comfort she'll never forget. Breakfast done, Clara readies herself to leave, pulling on a heavy woolen cloak. The scratch of the fabric on her arms and the weight across her shoulders feel like protection and readiness, the peasant's armor against wind and cold. The sun sits low in a clear sky, and a day of hard work waits. She hugs her grandmother, feeling the bones' fragility and the spirit's unbreakable strength, the kind that feeds on knowledge and the quiet hope tended in the garden. Stepping outside, she meets the sting of cold air, sharp enough to wake her fully. The village lies under a low morning mist, rising from damp ground. She heads toward the fields to join the others, carrying with her the tea's warmth and the bread's strength. Her footsteps fall soft on the packed, moist earth, muted by fog, a companionable hush along the way to the waiting soil. The landscape looks ethereal, almost poetic. Trees and huts blur into silhouettes, while the sun, straining through the haze, lays a silvery sheen across the fields, turning routine into a scene of quiet mystery. Clara thinks about the gentle contrast between the mist, hiding hard reality, and the bread in her stomach, the most concrete truth of all, the food that fuels the day. That daily tension between dream and matter is the very line her peasant life walks. As she walks, she remembers another of her grandmother's lessons about poor folks' food in the Middle Ages, the importance of salt for preserving meat, especially pork, and fish in coastal villages. Inland, salt was expensive and often taxed, limiting preservation and forcing people to eat what little fresh meat they had right away. Genevieve taught Clara to use hearth ashes, rich in minerals, as a partial stand-in for salt in certain preparations, a frugal, clever technique showing the constant search for simple, effective answers to daily privations. At the fields, Clara finds Etienne already hitching the oxen to the plough. She greets him with a nod and takes the reins, the stiff leather biting pleasantly into her hands, a tactile reminder of strength and work. The oxen's lowing and the clink of chains fill the air, the mechanical music of rural labor repeated across centuries. With the first press of the plough into heavy, wet soil, the day's rhythm begins. Fieldwork is an exercise in patience and attention. Every furrow must be true, and the farmer must read the land, its resistance, its moisture, to know when to plant. Clara uses her strength and focus to keep the plough steady. The smell of freshly turned earth rises strong and comforting, the perfume of fertility and promise, the most important scent in her life. As the sun climbs and the fog thins, the field slowly warms. Clara feels heat gather across her back, welcome after the morning's cold. She slips off her cloak and hangs it on the plough, then works on, her body warming from within. The repetitive motion and steady sound settle her mind. It drifts to light thoughts and to images of her grandmother in the garden, the green refuge waiting at day's end. The flavor lingering in her mouth is dark bread and garlic, rustic, persistent, a reminder to keep her focus and her strength. Every stroke is an investment in the future, each step toward a harvest that will sustain her family and the village. Food here is more than nourishment. It's the engine of life, the force that keeps the body moving when weariness presses hard. Etienne comes over and offers a skin of weak ale, dark, slightly sour, the peasant's drink. Clara takes long swallows, feeling the coolness and barley's gentle sweetness, welcome relief for a dry throat. Safer and more nourishing than water, ale is essential, liquid fuel for work and for meals. She thanks him with a nod, and their quiet camaraderie steadies them both against life's hardness. By midday, the heat is intense. Clara recalls how her grandmother always insisted on roots and tubers, turnips and old varieties of carrots, grown extensively for their essential nutrients in the cold months. From Genevieve, she learned to simmer turnips low and slow until they softened and sweetened, a simple technique that turns a humble vegetable into comfort, a flavor secret she'll use in tonight's soup. The afternoon is set aside for sowing barley, the hardiest, most reliable grain for their climate. Clara and Etienne walk the furrows, casting seed with a practiced, even sweep. The soft, dry patter of kernels on damp soil is the sound of hope in its purest form. She touches the ground with her hands, feeling its cool, loose texture, and whispers a quiet prayer for rain and sun, the two gifts that turn seed into bread. Planting is where work and faith meet. The farmer does her part, but the outcome rests with nature's strength and a grace beyond her reach. Clara knows her life is a constant negotiation with uncertainty. The only things she can govern are the quality of her work and her grandmother's wisdom. Moving with the land, she feels herself part of a cycle larger than any one life, and that kinship calms her with a steady sense of purpose. As the sun sinks, the sky fills with warm, gentle colors, oranges and violets playing against the browns and greens of the fields. Clara and Etienne finish for the day, and a deep, contented quiet settles, the hush of honest exhaustion. She heads home, body spent, heart at ease, the scent of earth in her clothes and hair, a perfume that is both her identity and her story. The image that walks beside her on the road back is Geneviève at the hearth, with fire lit and soup waiting, the guardian of comfort and hope, the master of turning a little into enough. Clara's steps, slow but fluid despite the fatigue, carry a simple certainty. Night will bring rest, morning will begin the cycle again, and bread, earth, and hope will remain the unshakable pillars of her peasant life. Night deepens over the small village, and the sense of refuge inside Clara and Genevieve's cabin feels sharper against the cold and darkness outside, where only a distant dog's howl breaks the heavy silence. The hearth, now reduced to a soft bed of glowing coals, releases a slow, steady warmth, just enough to keep the chill at bay and to cook the soup waiting for them. The sight of the embers, tiny stars trapped at the bottom of the fireplace, is hypnotic and soothing. Genevieve's shadow stretches long and trembling across the clay wall, a figure of wisdom and patience presiding over their modest world. The aroma of the potage has reached its peak, a deep, complex perfume born of hours of slow simmering and Genevieve's secret blend of herbs. Tonight she's used wild celery root and a bit of leek gathered by the riverbank, ingredients that add a peppery, earthy flavor, a true luxury in a peasant's diet. Clara sits at the table, feeling the gentle warmth rising from the pot, while the faint, rhythmic bubbling of the broth becomes the day's final note, a melody of comfort well earned. Her grandmother serves the soup in 2 clay bowls, and the warmth seeping into Clara's hands is the most welcome feeling of all. Steam rises as Geneviève reminds her that soup should never be rushed but savored, so the body can fully absorb its heat and nourishment. Potage is the foundation of every peasant meal, its versatility the key to survival, able to turn scraps of meat, a few vegetables, and hard bread into something whole and sustaining. With the unhurried rhythm of age, Geneviève dips dark bread into the soup and tells Clara about medieval Jewish communities who lived in rural Europe. Bound by dietary laws like kashrut, they often relied on vegetable and grain-based dishes, becoming masters of preservation and non-meat cookery. Their influence quietly enriched local cuisine, weaving new techniques into peasant traditions. This small human story of coexistence and cultural exchange adds depth to village life, showing how even in humble places a tapestry of traditions thrived. Wrapped in the warmth of the soup and the hearth, Clara feels a deep serenity. The contrast between the day's physical labor and this gentle moment of rest is a blessing. She dips another piece of bread into the broth. The softened texture and heat in her mouth are pure comfort, and the rich blend of Genevieve's herbs is her reward. Her grandmother smiles softly and says the true secret of soup is time, the slow cooking that fuses flavors and makes the food easier to digest. It's a metaphor for life itself. Patience and stillness are what let things ripen. Tonight's small historical note is about dairy. Genevieve explains that cow's milk was often a luxury. Most peasants depended on goat or sheep milk, more accessible and hardy. Cheese was the most common way to consume dairy, sour, salty, homemade, and it provided vital protein alongside grains and legumes. With quiet pride, Genevieve reveals a small treasure, a wedge of salted goat cheese saved for special meals. Clara closes her eyes, breathing in the food's warmth and aroma. In her mind's eye, she sees the freshly ploughed field, the dark, damp soil where barley seeds now rest, waiting for sun and rain to awaken them. The image, a symbol of hope, contrasts with the uneasy knowledge that winter is near, bringing scarcity. Sensing her granddaughter's shift in mood, Genevieve reminds her that the earth is generous but demands respect, and that saving summer's gifts is the only way to face the cold months with dignity. Genevieve rises and takes a small clay pot from beside the hearth, pulling out a piece of the salted goat cheese, a hidden treasure. She slices it thin and offers some to Clara, who eats it reverently. The sharp, tangy flavor cuts beautifully through the soup's softness, turning a humble dinner into a quiet celebration. The grandmother insists that even in scarcity, food must be celebrated, for every meal is a victory over hunger, a testament to human creativity and the will to find warmth and pleasure in simplicity. The taste of cheese lingers on Clara's tongue, a complete satisfaction. She understands the lesson. Peasant life is built on small joys and silent wisdom. Genevieve adds that beer and wine were staples in the Middle Ages, not only for taste, but for health. Weak in alcohol, yet believed to strengthen the blood and ward off melancholy. Even children drank them, part of the daily rhythm of nourishment and faith. As night advances, silence thickens inside the cabin, broken only by the gentle crackle of wood. Clara and Genevieve sit in contentment, their bodies warm and bellies full, a peace radiating from the hearth. The grandmother begins to card wool for the coming winter, her slow, steady hands preparing for the future. The soft, rhythmic sound of wool being drawn into thread is the last thing Clara hears before she prepares to sleep. The sight of her grandmother bent over her work, lit by the flicker of the fire, is an image of dignity and endurance, the embodiment of the medieval woman who, though poor, holds the essential knowledge to sustain her family. Clara feels grateful for this inheritance of wisdom, which teaches her to value not what is costly, but what is vital: bread, fire, and the quiet love of kinship. Age has sharpened Genevieve's senses, and she tells Clara she can smell the change in the air, the metallic, crisp scent that warns of the first frosts, a sign that abundance is ending and lean times are near. The peasant lives in rhythm with the earth's cycles, and the nose becomes both calendar and weather guide, helping them prepare for what's coming. Clara lies on her cot, wrapped in coarse wool, the hearth's warmth still touching her skin. The memory of the soup's deep flavor and the salted cheese lingers, the proof that even in scarcity, life holds sweetness and delight, born of her grandmother's wisdom and the garden's quiet generosity. The embers fade slowly, a tender metaphor for the day's close, the shift from fierce flame to soft warmth, the full circle of energy. Clara drifts into sleep, lulled by the rhythm of wool being spun and the faint scent of smoke and herbs, a serene, well-earned rest, ready for the next cycle of bread, soil, and labor. Genevieve leans over, kisses her granddaughter's forehead, and whispers that true wealth is health and knowledge, and that as long as the garden grows and the herbs keep their secrets, the family will have hope. That gentle message, calm and timeless, is the last sound Clara hears, the voice of wisdom guiding and protecting her, the silent inheritance that makes her strong. Clara's sleep is deep and dreamless, the rest of her body spent and renewed. The cabin is a sanctuary of peace. The feudal world beyond its walls feels distant, suspended in darkness. Only the soft warmth of the hearth and the presence of her grandmother remain, the anchors that steady her in the storms of rural life. The scent of lemon balm and bread, home's true perfume, fills her dreams, wrapping her in comfort. She sleeps knowing that morning will bring the same ritual of bread and work, and the same promise that the evening soup will be rich again, flavored by her grandmother's secrets. The slow, descriptive rhythm of this night is your own invitation to rest, traveler. Feel the gentle heat, the scent of smoke, the sound of quiet. Let the image of the warm cabin and the wise grandmother cradle you in serenity, a refuge of peace in the heart of the Middle Ages. One small detail that lingers unseen in this humble home is the absence of personal plates or utensils. Soup was often eaten straight from a shared bowl or from a hollowed piece of bread used as a vessel, and the knife was the only personal tool at the table. This simple fact deepens the sense of community and sharing that defined medieval life, a small but profound truth of the era. Now lying on her own cot, Geneviève watches the last embers fade. The light is nearly gone. Only a faint glow remains. She reflects on the cycle of life: seed, harvest, fire, soup, sleep, the endless repetition that is the peasant's essence. In silence she prays for rain and sun, the unseen guardians of their sustenance. Her quiet contemplation is the final image of the night, the acceptance of life in both its hardship and beauty, and the understanding that true happiness lies in finding peace and comfort within simplicity. She smiles faintly, a smile of wisdom and gratitude, and surrenders to sleep, a rest well earned after a day of care and devotion. The flavor of hope, mingled with the scent of smoke and bread, is what carries her into slumber. She knows she has planted more than seeds in the garden. She has sown hope in Clara's heart, and that is the greatest legacy she could ever leave. Clara and Geneviève's days settle into a slow yet unbreakable rhythm, shaped by the agricultural cycles and the constant demand for subsistence. The element of fire, explored so deeply before, now shows itself in how it's kept alive. The next morning, Clara watches her grandmother's meticulous care as she revives the embers. Geneviève uses a small metal shovel to gently blow air over the glowing remains of the night, a gesture that is more than practical, almost ceremonial, honoring the element that sustains their warmth and life. The soft hiss of her breath and the rising scent of ashes and charred wood create the perfume of safety, proof that the fire, the heart of the home, never truly dies. The morning feels cold to the touch. Clara pulls on her thick wool gloves before reaching for the clay pot that holds her portion of water, icy against her palms. Smiling, Geneviève offers her another cup of lemon balm tea, its sweet warmth a gentle preparation for the day ahead. She reminds Clara that keeping the fire alive was as essential in the Middle Ages as preserving food itself. Lighting a new fire was slow and difficult, and losing it in an isolated village could mean disaster. When that happened, neighbors would share their embers, a gesture of solidarity, but also a silent sign of hardship. Under the pale morning light, Geneviève's secret garden reveals its careful design. Herbs arranged in small raised beds, bordered by woven willow branches, a microcosm of order in the vast disorder of the fields beyond. The grandmother moves slowly among the plants, murmuring softly to them as if in conversation, a ritual of respect for the living world she tends. She explains that using natural fertilizers, such as hearth ashes and animal manure, keeps the soil fertile, preserving its strength through foresight and care. As she harvests burdock root, known for its nourishing and medicinal properties, Genevieve shares a small historical note about the vital role of women in medieval horticulture. Household gardens were traditionally a woman's domain. She was the keeper of herbal wisdom, of seasonings and cures. It was a quiet power, complementing the men's large-scale farming. Genevieve's garden is a living emblem of that feminine strength, the ability to provide health and flavor within the limits of a rigid, patriarchal world. Clara heads to the fields, surrounded by the scent of damp, cold earth where the barley seeds rest. Today's task is maintenance, pulling weeds that compete with the crop. It's slow, patient work, done by hand, grounding her through touch and rhythm. The soil's chill against her fingers and the roughness of the roots she pulls are a tactile reminder of the contrast between wildness and cultivation. The deliberate pace calms her, drawing her mind into the steady pulse of the land. In the distance, Etienne repairs a section of the wooden fence. Clara joins him quietly, their companionship wordless but easy. The dry, steady sound of his hammer blends with the faint rustle of her movements, forming a kind of rustic music. She remembers something her grandmother once told her about peasant food, that nuts and wild chestnuts, gathered in autumn and stored carefully, were a vital source of oil and energy during the cold months, a rare supplement to replace the fat they couldn't afford. At midday, the sun bears down heavily, heat pressing against the back of Clara's neck. She drinks from her leather flask, the weak ale's faint tang, refreshing and nourishing. The view before her, pale green weeds against dark ploughed soil, is an image of perseverance, a quiet battle between order and chaos, between what's cultivated and what insists on growing wild. That evening, back in the cabin, Genevieve prepares the soup. Tonight she focuses on color, a deep, dark green, thanks to the addition of beet and burdock leaves. The sight of the steaming pot is comforting, and its scent, rich and earthy, fills the room. She explains that understanding color was once part of a cook's wisdom. Color revealed nourishment. The darker the green, the stronger the soup, an elixir for tired bodies. Clara holds the warm clay bowl between her hands as Genevieve shares another curiosity. In medieval times, fresh meat was rare for peasants. Hunting was a privilege of the nobility, and slaughtering a pig or chicken was an event. Most meat was eaten salted or smoked, and pork fat, lard, was the true treasure, used to flavor soups, grease bread, and fuel celebrations. Tonight's soup tastes richer than usual, the sweetness of beet mingling with burdock's faint bitterness, a complex, grounding flavor. Genevieve insists that variety, however small, is the secret to both health and joy, and that her secret garden is her way of preserving that variety, a quiet act of love and defiance against monotony. As night deepens, Genevieve turns to her craft. She shows Clara a small, time-worn parchment written in rough Latin, its letters nearly faded, a collection of recipes and remedies passed down from her own mother. Inside lie the secrets of herbal mixtures, cooking times and preservation methods, a treasury of folk wisdom handled with reverence. She explains the roles of onion and garlic in both medieval cooking and medicine. Easy to grow, they were believed to guard against illness and plague. People ate them raw, cooked or ground into salves. Their sharp odor was thought to prove their power, an old belief rooted in experience as much as faith. The sight of the old parchment in Genevieve's hands is a symbol of continuity. The faint smell of mold and earth that rises from it is the scent of history itself, a tangible link to generations of women who, like Clara, fought to feed and heal their families with what the land provided. Clara recalls another curious detail, the absence of forks at the medieval peasant's table. The fork, still a luxury of nobles, would only become common centuries later. Peasants ate with their hands, using a single knife and wooden spoons for soup, a simplicity that reflected both necessity and humility. The grandmother's voice grows low and steady as she describes recipes in detail. She talks about slow-cooked dried fruits, plums and apples, softened in wine with spices like cinnamon and clove, a rare luxury once believed to strengthen the body and the spirit during harsh winters. It was another way of turning scarcity into delight. When Geneviève describes her garden as a small map of fallen stars, Clara understands what she means. Each plant is a promise of healing, of taste, of beauty. Her grandmother teaches her to find wonder in simplicity, to notice richness in small things, to turn repetition into gratitude, a philosophy that transcends both cooking and labor. Dinner ends in quiet. The last crumb of bread sinks into the soup, and Clara feels an overwhelming sense of belonging to this home, this story, this inherited wisdom. She knows that even under the weight of the feudal world, her family holds something untaxable, the ancestral knowledge of surviving with dignity, of finding hope in the soil. The cabin cools again. With a practiced hand, Geneviève covers the embers with ash, an act of care ensuring warmth for the next dawn. The sight of grey ash blanketing faint light is an image of protection and prudence, a quiet promise that life will rekindle tomorrow. Clara lies down, the scent of soup, herbs and smoke blending into the perfume of home. The slow rhythm of her grandmother's life soothes her to sleep, filling her mind with images of fire, bread and green leaves, the pillars of their existence. Outside, under the moonlight, the small garden sleeps, a silent sanctuary of resilience, gathering strength for the next day's harvest. Clara dreams of it expanding endlessly, full of color and fragrance, a vision of abundance and peace that nourishes her as she sleeps. Her last sensations are the feel of warm wool against her skin and the wind brushing softly against the cabin walls, not as a threat, but as the gentle, familiar voice of nature standing guard. Still in the cabin's hush, before the day truly begins to lighten, Geneviève turns her thoughts to food, specifically to the wood that feeds the fire. She explains to Clara that the type of fuel used in the hearth shapes the flavor of both soup and bread. Oak burns slowly, giving a steady heat and a mild smoke, perfect for the long simmering of potage. Peat, more common, produces dense smoke and a strong smell that clings to everything. In this moment, smell reigns supreme. Geneviève can tell which wood is burning in any hearth in the village by scent alone, a quiet, hard-won knowledge of the peasant world's simple physics and everyday chemistry. Clara stirs the embers with a bit more vigor, and the dry, clean crackle of fresh oak promises a steadier fire and a purer taste for today's bread. She feels the rough, cold wood in her hands, and the extra work of chopping and carrying this finer fuel is a task she welcomes, knowing that the fire's quality becomes a more nourishing, more flavorful meal, an investment paid back in comfort and health. The morning's rhythm centers on oat porridge, their constant, reliable breakfast. Geneviève insists on oats, a hardy, resilient grain, the staple of Northern Europe, because it grows in poor soil and lends itself to countless preparations. The porridge is made with boiled water and thickened with a pinch of hearth ash, rich in minerals, and a handful of dried herbs, turning something plain into a morning tonic. A lesson in how necessity sharpens ingenuity. The porridge, a thick grey cream, looks humble, but its taste is surprisingly rich and savoury thanks to the ash and herbs. Geneviève tells Clara about the scarcity of fats in a peasant diet. Walnuts or linseed oil, when they could be had, and pork fat tocino were the only real sources. Fat wasn't just flavour. It was the main supplier of calories and the energy needed for heavy work. a precious good guarded as carefully as the fire itself. She shares a curiosity about Lent, that season of fasting and penance strictly observed. During Lent, meat and dairy were forbidden, which forced peasants to lean even more on grains, legumes and fish, salted or dried if they could get it. The restriction was religious, yes, but also practical. It conserved resources by keeping animals alive longer for later slaughter, a subtle meeting of faith and subsistence. Clara heads to the fields, surrounded by the cool, damp smell of soil, where she'll continue pulling weeds. The cold air nips at her hands, and the ground feels rough beneath her fingers, but the steady warmth of the morning porridge holds her up. She pictures her grandmother at home, spinning wool and tending the garden, and the thought fills her with a quiet sense of rightness, each of them doing her part in the family's living cycle. The abbey bell rings the morning Angelus, its echo carrying across village and field, a reminder of the church's constant presence in daily life. Clara joins the other peasants, and the slow, meditative work of clearing the rows begins, an exercise in patience and attention that binds her closely to the land. Back in the garden, Geneviève focuses on legumes, the peasant diet's pillars of protein. She checks the young fava beans and peas planted early and explains the importance of letting them dry in the sun before storing them in clay jars, a preservation method that kept them available through winter, when meat was only a dream. The sight of the dried favas, small and wrinkled, is the image of modest, essential wealth. Peasants often ground their own grain, frequently with rough hand mills, before taking it to the Lord's mill and paying the banalité. The flour was always coarse and whole, since sifting fine white flour was laborious, and the byproduct, bran, was valuable as animal feed. It was a tidy, circular economy, a way of life with little waste. In the garden's air, Genevieve's nose catches the faint sweetness of collard greens, a hardy, nourishing plant she tends with care. She picks a few leaves and carries them inside for the evening soup. Another small act of foresight, ensuring both flavor and nutrients for the day's most important meal. Clara's work in the field goes on. The handle of her hoe is smooth with age, warm against her palms, an extension of her own body. The steady, rhythmic thud of the blade into soil is the sound of her perseverance. The fatigue is real, but the satisfaction of clean rows and ready earth is its own reward. Toward evening, the cabin greets her with the fragrance of slowly simmered soup, collards and fava, an invitation to warmth and rest. Geneviève sits near the hearth, mending clothes, a picture of peace and unending care, the medieval woman who never truly stops providing, even in stillness. Tonight's soup is thicker and sweeter, thanks to the fava and greens, a comforting, nourishing sensation in every spoonful. Clara savors it, feeling strength seep back into her body, and the dark bread dipped into the broth tastes like safety and gratitude. In a soft voice, her grandmother tells her that peasant life is hard, but the greatest tragedy is loneliness in poverty. The village's true wealth lies in its ability to share bread and knowledge, a philosophy she lives through her secret garden, always open to neighbors in need. The rough linen cloth she uses to wipe the bowls is coarse to the touch, yet the care itself, the small, careful gesture, feels like a blessing over food and home. Wrapped in that quiet attention, Clara feels loved without a word being spoken. Outside, the wind rises, a muted sign that winter edges closer, bringing new trials. Hearing it, Geneviève adds more ash over the embers, prudence and preparation in a single motion, a way of keeping warmth ready for the long night ahead. Clara lies down, and the scents of collards, bread and smoke gather around her like a calm, familiar cloak. The steady rhythm of her grandmother's days, work, prayer, tending, becomes a lullaby. She drifts off with her mind full of green, of dried grain, of gentle heat, the pillars of her hope. In the story that slips into Clara's sleep, She sees Etienne, the neighbor, struggling with his harvest. Geneviève, quietly and without fuss, has already prepared an extra portion of fava and herbs for him, an act of unspoken charity at the heart of their communal life. The cabin, lit only by the faint glow of embers, becomes a small universe of warmth and knowledge in the vast, dark cold of the medieval world, a refuge and a steady light. Her grandmother's final contemplation is simple and sure. Peasant life, though marked by want, carries its own beauty and dignity, the gift of finding sustenance and hope in the soil. It's a treasure she passes to her granddaughter with love and wisdom. With the arrival of St. Michael's season, the air in the village begins to change. The summer's vibrant green gives way to shades of ochre and yellow as the leaves dry, and daylight shortens perceptibly, announcing the inevitability of autumn, the time of the final harvest and preparation for the harshness of winter. The body feels this shift. Mornings are darker, slower to warm, demanding extra effort just to move. Clara now follows a new rhythm. Beyond baking bread, she helps Geneviève gather and preserve the last vegetables from the garden, an intense, forward-looking labor essential to surviving the cold months ahead. The scent of the soil is no longer that fresh, damp perfume of spring planting, but the dry, heavy smell of decomposing leaves mingled with the sharp odor of peat smoke, rising earlier and lingering later each day, a sign that hearths now work harder against the cold. The sound of Clara's footsteps along the path is joined by the brittle rustle of fallen leaves beneath her shoes, a soft, nostalgic rhythm of decay and renewal. A poetic reminder of a cycle nearing its close. If once their worry was planting, now it's preserving, turning what perishes quickly into lasting sustenance. Genevieve's garden is slowly being emptied. The grandmother spends her days teaching Clara how to dry herbs and fruit, how to ferment and salt vegetables in clay pots. This knowledge is the family's true wealth, a savings account of wisdom against hunger. As she hangs bundles of thyme and sage near the hearth, Geneviève shares what she knows about meat preservation. The slaughter of a pig, when a family was lucky enough to have one, was a major event in peasant life. Nearly all the meat was salted and smoked to last through the year. The fat, tocino, was kept in clay jars and was so valuable it nearly served as currency, an essential source of flavor and calories during winter. Medieval life, she says, was defined by the careful management of scarce resources. Clara focuses on the feel of the dry herbs between her fingers, the fragile texture, the concentrated aroma, the scent of summer preserved. The work is slow and delicate, but she does it with a sense of purpose, knowing that every bundle of herbs, every pinch of salt packed into a pot is a small step toward a safer winter and a tastier soup, an act of love and foresight disguised as routine. The cabin is now filled with the quiet bustle of preparation. The low ceiling is hung with herbs and garlic, while the corners brim with clay pots of vegetables in brine, a modest abundance that stands in contrast to the poverty of their lives. Smiling, Geneviève calls autumn the harvest of hope, for what they store now will sustain them later. She teaches Clara how to dry beans and grains. Without barns, peasants spread them on the cabin floor near the hearth or up in the loft, where residual warmth drove off moisture and kept rats away. Home and granary became one, and the faint, steady sound of grains being raked across the floor became the music of autumn. Clara recalls one of Genevieve's stories, a famine so severe that peasants were forced to eat papyrus roots when they could find them, and to mix soil and ground bark into their flour to make bread. It's a grim memory, a glimpse of life's fragility, and it makes Clara cherish even more the dark bread and simple soup she enjoys each day. Her grandmother uses the tale gently, as a reminder of the importance of foresight and knowledge. Out in the fields, the men harvest winter grains and grind them at the Lord's mill. From afar, Clara hears the rhythmic clatter of the water wheel, a sound that brings both comfort and unease, for it promises flour, but also reminds them of the banalité, the fee that costs them a piece of their hard work. To a peasant, the mill's sound is always double-edged, labor and submission intertwined. Geneviève shows Clara how to salt cabbage to make an early form of sauerkraut, a fermented staple that keeps for months and adds a sharp, tangy flavor to their meals. The scent of shredded, salted cabbage fills the cabin, strong, pungent, the smell of preservation itself. She explains that fermentation was the simplest, safest way to keep vegetables edible, its acidity warding off spoilage, a kind of peasant science born from necessity. The sight of clay pots lined neatly in a row, each filled with salted cabbage and vegetables, gives the cabin a sense of order and preparedness. Geneviève places a heavy stone on top of the cabbage to keep it submerged, and the cool, damp feel of the stone under her fingers is the final touch, a quiet act of assurance that her family will be fed. As night falls, Clara and Geneviève sit together by the fire for supper. Tonight's soup is a celebration of the harvest, made with the last fresh turnips and a touch of salted pork, the smoky, savory taste of true comfort. Her grandmother insists that food, in times of uncertainty, must be eaten with gratitude and joy, so that the spirit stays strong. Clara lies down afterward, the fading warmth of the embers and the scent of burned wood wrapping her like a blanket. The soft whistle of wind through the shutters reminds her of the world outside, but the safety of the cabin feels absolute. She falls asleep, wrapped in the warmth of nourishment, her rest the earned reward of a prudent peasant. Her final thought is of the clay pots filled with preserved vegetables, the family's little time capsules, the taste of summer sealed away to meet the winter ahead. They are a quiet metaphor for resilience and hope, renewed with every passing season. Preparing for winter turns Clara's cabin into a hive of quiet movement, a reshaping of domestic space to meet the season's demands. Geneviève now devotes herself to processing the last roots and tubers from the garden, working over a rough wooden board placed near the faint light of the single window. The feel of damp soil clinging to the turnips and parsnips she scrubs with a straw-bristle brush is her final touch of earth before these roots enter the cycle of preservation, a passage from the outer world into the safety of the family's stores. The soft, steady rasp of the brush is the rhythm of foresight, a work song that fills the cabin and readies it for the coming scarcity. Geneviève shows Clara one of the simplest and most reliable ways to preserve roots, burying them in boxes filled with dry sand. The sand keeps moisture and frost at bay while still allowing the vegetables to breathe, keeping them fresh for months. The sight of the fine yellowish sand poured carefully over turnips and parsnips feels almost ceremonial, a small triumph of resourcefulness. She explains that this method of burying freshness is an old peasant secret, a way to ensure the presence of raw vegetables, vital sources of vitamins, even in the dead of winter, when soup is the only daily meal. Each turnip laid into the sand lifts a weight from Clara's heart. It's a quiet promise that they won't rely solely on bread and dried legumes. Her grandmother reminds her that the difference between endurance and suffering lies in knowing how to keep food in its most natural form. She tells of a brutal winter when a single fresh turnip found in February saved a sick child, a story that magnifies the worth of that humble vegetable. Another detail of peasant ingenuity lies beneath their beds. Wooden platforms used not only for sleeping but also for storing food. The packed earth floor, warmed indirectly by the hearth, helped maintain a stable temperature, protecting the vegetables from freezing. The cabin thus becomes a living system, part home, part storeroom, where life and sustenance intertwine. The mingled scent of wood, earth and fire becomes the true fragrance of home. Clara, who spent the day gathering the last bundles of centauri, a small tonic herb, returns to the cabin with hands rough and cold. The contrast between the outdoor chill and the cabin's dry heat is her daily comfort. She moves close to the hearth, feeling the warmth radiate through her skin, an instant balm for her tired body. Her grandmother is brewing the week's weak ale, a process that begins with boiling barley mash and adding wild hops gathered from the forest. The hops act as both flavor and preservative, replacing the exotic spices the poor could never afford. The smell of barley, sweet and earthy, blends with the bitter aroma of the hops, creating a fragrance that marks the peasant's drink as surely as bread marks the peasant's table. Geneviève explains that in medieval times, ale was often drunk before fermentation was complete. It was low in alcohol, but rich in nutrients, a liquid food, vital for both workers and children. So essential was it that local authorities regulated its production and checked its quality, for ale was the foundation of hydration and nourishment for nearly everyone. The sight of the thick, dark liquid bubbling in the pot is an image of simple alchemy, the transformation of grain into warmth and strength. The gentle, simmering sound is a promise of endurance. As Geneviève stirs with a large wooden spoon, the rising steam fills the cabin, the essence of medieval comfort. Night brings the familiar rhythm of supper, fava bean and cabbage soup, enriched tonight with a small piece of salted pork, a luxury saved for this season of transition. The salty, smoky taste deepens the broth, adding warmth and richness that soothe Clara's weary body. Clara remembers how her grandmother once told her about the custom of giving old bread or trenchers to beggars and pilgrims who came knocking, a charitable act required by both church law and feudal ethics, but also a clever way to avoid waste. Even generosity, Geneviève had said, was part of the household's careful economy. Her grandmother reflects that preserving food is, in truth, the extension of summer's mercy, a way of storing nature's generosity for the lean months ahead. Patience and discipline in autumn, she says, are the twin pillars of a winter without hunger. Now the embers in the hearth are covered in ash, proof that warmth has been secured for the night. The clay bowl in Clara's hands feels smooth and hot, and the mingled scent of smoke and salted pork is the very perfume of safety. When she lies down, the slow rhythm of Geneviève's breathing, already deep in sleep, becomes Clara's lullaby. She drifts off, body warm and nourished, her thoughts resting on the buried turnips and the fermenting ale, symbols of quiet security and faith in the future. The final image that carries her into sleep is that of the ale pot, covered with a cloth in the cabin's shadowy corner, the thick, dark liquid working silently, a reflection of her own body as it, too, renews itself in silence for the day to come. Morning light enters Clara's cabin differently now in this deepening autumn. A slanted amber beam falls across the rough wooden table, illuminating a single humble object, the stone grinder Geneviève uses to crush dried herbs and, at times, a handful of grains for porridge. It is in this worn tool, smoothed by generations of hands, that our intimate gaze rests, for it embodies both the unbroken rhythm of manual labor and the quiet mastery of the peasant woman over her family's nourishment. The rough, cool texture of the stone beneath Clara's palms, as she grinds a mixture of wild mustard and coriander seeds, is the tactile link between tradition and daily toil. The focal gesture is Geneviève's slow, circular motion as she works the grinder. She teaches Clara that grinding must be done patiently, one handful at a time, so the stone doesn't overheat, and the seeds retain their essential oils, the true treasure of any spice. The gentle, rhythmic scrape of stone against stone becomes a kind of mantra, a soothing sound that fills the stillness of morning, the quiet music of raw ingredients turning into flavor. The sight of the old woman bent over the grinder is almost poetic. Her fingers, wrinkled and hardened from years in the garden, move with a delicate precision. The dust of crushed coriander rising in the sunbeam looks almost ethereal, a fragrant miracle drawn from what is dry and humble. The smell of mustard and coriander, sharp, earthy and bright, spreads through the cabin, blending with the heavier scent of smoke, adding a spark of spice that lifts the simplicity of their world. Geneviève explains the place of local spices in medieval Europe. For peasants, she says, exotic spices like pepper and cinnamon were distant legends, reserved for nobles and merchants. So the poor turned to the gifts of their own soil, wild herbs and native seeds like garlic, mustard, and coriander. Mustard seeds were crushed and fermented into a rough, tangy paste, while coriander brought color and life to soups and stews. These were the spices of the poor, flavors born of ingenuity, transforming survival into something almost joyful. Clara recalls one of her grandmother's stories about Barnabé, an old neighbor who had lost his teeth and could eat nothing but thin oat porridge. Geneviève, using her stone grinder, always prepared for him a small portion of extra fine barley flour mixed with herbs, a quiet act of kindness that showed how labor and compassion intertwined in rural life, where mutual care was a condition of survival. She feels the soft warmth rising from the hearth and the faint chill of air entering through the open door. Tasting a pinch of the freshly ground mustard, Clara senses the sharp, biting heat on her tongue, a welcome jolt that fully wakes her. Her grandmother reminds her that seasoning is the soul of food, and that even the simplest soup, when well flavored, can nourish the spirit. The day's final gesture is Geneviève gathering the fragrant powder into a small linen pouch, which she stores in a tightly sealed wooden box to preserve its aroma, a tiny treasure of flavor to be used sparingly in the evening soup. The sight of that modest linen sack holding such precious fragrance is an image of quiet satisfaction and self-reliance. Clara feels herself woven into this lineage, the guardian of the grinder and the keeper of peasant spices, a link in an unbroken chain of feminine wisdom. The serene atmosphere of the cabin, filled with the mingling scents of spice, bread and smoke, is her refuge, a place where life, though hard, is rich in meaning and taste. With the stone grinder put away and the scent of peasant spices still lingering in the cabin, Geneviève turns her quiet, contemplative gaze toward the ceramic jar that holds her most guarded treasure, salt. For the medieval peasant, salt was far more than a seasoning. It was preservation itself, the thin white line between survival and ruin. With careful hands, she lifts the lid, feeling the cool, grainy texture beneath her fingers. The faint, dry sound of salt being measured by the pinch is a ritual of restraint, a sign of value, for a handful of this mineral could mean the difference between meat spoiling and meat lasting through winter. In the dim autumn light, the salt glows faintly, small pale crystals reflecting the flicker of the hearth like a miniature treasure hoard. Geneviève speaks softly, explaining that salt in many regions was monopolized by nobles or taxed by the crown, making it an unaffordable luxury for most peasants. Because of this, common folk learned to replace it with ingenuity, ashes from certain plants rich in potassium, or the tartness of vinegar or rare citrus, lending flavor and acidity where salt was scarce. To salt bread was a luxury, but to salt life, to preserve and give it flavor, was a necessity. Geneviève says that the art of peasant cooking lies not in abundance, but in imagination, enhancing the earth's simplest gifts with the least waste possible. Herbs and roots, wild garlic, onion, nettle, become allies in flavor and health, turning hardship into quiet invention. She shows Clara the importance of pickles and brine in winter survival. Preserving cucumbers, cabbage, and roots in salted water allows them to ferment slowly, creating tangy flavor and essential nutrients. The sharp, acidic scent that escapes as Geneviève lifts the lid from a jar of brined cabbage fills the cabin with a pungent vitality, the smell of life prolonged through skill and patience. By the fire, Clara mends her grandmother's wool apron. The gentle warmth of the embers spreads across her legs, soothing the ache from long workdays. She glances toward Geneviève, whose eyes are fixed on the salt jar with reverent care. The image stirs a memory. Agnès, their neighbor, weeping with gratitude when Geneviève shared a handful of salt so she could cure the meat of a sheep found dead in the fields. That small gesture had saved the family from hunger, a reminder that salt could indeed mean salvation. When Geneviève seals the jar again, her movement is solemn, almost ceremonial. She melts a bit of beeswax and drips it carefully around the lid to keep out moisture and mice. The faint scent of wax mingles with smoke and herbs, and when she finally hides the jar beneath the floorboards, Clara feels as if she's watching the burial of a relic. It is both treasure and promise, the heart of foresight and prudence that defines peasant life, where nothing is wasted and everything is guarded. From the hearth, the aroma of baking bread begins to bloom. Clara kneads the coarse dough infused with a trace of their newly ground mustard. Its scent is earthy and sharp, filling the air with warmth and a subtle spice that makes her mouth water. The texture of the dough beneath her hands, grainy, alive, yielding, is one of her favorite sensations. In that tactile rhythm, she feels continuity and purpose. Her grandmother tells her that even bread without salt can have soul, as long as it's made with care and seasoned by patience. It's not salt alone that gives taste, she says, but the hands that work it. Clara smiles faintly, knowing this to be true. The essence of peasant wisdom lies not in what they possess, but in what they make of what's left. The golden crust of the loaf crackles as it cools, and the smell of fresh bread mingles with the smoke from the fire. Geneviève cuts a small piece, spreads it with a hint of mustard paste, and offers it to Clara. The flavor is bold and simple, earth, seed, and labor combined. It is nourishment and poetry in the same bite. As dusk falls, the thin blue smoke rising from the chimney curls upward into the grey sky. Clara stands by the doorway, watching it dissolve into the mist. She reflects on the balance of their days, how every grain, every herb, and every pinch of salt carries meaning far beyond its measure. In a world of scarcity, even survival becomes an art form. The evening deepens and silence returns. The rhythmic ticking of cooling wood, the whisper of embers shifting, and the faint crackle of the fire are the house's heartbeat. To Clara, this sound is not emptiness, but continuity, the music of ordinary endurance. Geneviève hums softly while preparing the evening meal. Tonight's soup is humble, just cabbage and barley, but Clara knows it will taste rich once her grandmother adds a pinch of the spice mix and a hint of vinegar for brightness. Even in poverty, Geneviève creates harmony through balance, smoke and salt, earth and fire, bitterness and sweetness. When they sit to eat, the first spoonful is always a pause, a moment of thanks unspoken but deeply felt. The soup is warm, slightly tangy, alive. Clara savors it slowly, knowing that within that taste lies every act of care that brought it here. The grinding, the fermenting, the storing, the guarding. After the meal, Geneviève wipes the bowls with a rough linen cloth. The texture is coarse, but the gesture is graceful. Every act of cleaning and saving is also an act of gratitude, an acknowledgement that nothing should slip through careless fingers. Outside, the wind grows stronger. It whistles softly through the cracks in the window frame, a steady reminder of the cold, pressing closer each night. Geneviève listens for a moment, then adds another layer of ash to the hearth. sealing in the warmth for morning. The grey veil settles gently over the embers like a prayer. Clara lies down, her body warm beneath the wool blanket. The cabin smells of bread, smoke, and herbs, the trinity of her existence. Her eyes grow heavy, her breath sinking with the slow rhythm of her grandmother's. It is a lullaby without melody, only warmth and peace. She dreams of the salt jar beneath the floor, glowing faintly like a buried moon, guarding the promise of endurance. Around it, she imagines the grinder, the bread, and the jars of brine, each one a quiet guardian of survival. The poetic image that closes the night is the stone grinder resting on the table, waiting for dawn and the next seed to be transformed. In its silence, it holds all the wisdom of the world, that from the smallest effort, flavor is born. From labor, life. From scarcity, grace. And as the fire fades, the last flicker of light glints off a single grain of salt on the table, a bright, quiet reminder that even in the simplest lives there is brilliance in what endures. As autumn deepens, the central element of village life shifts toward the communal oven, a solid stone structure at the heart of the settlement. It isn't merely a place to bake bread, but the beating center of social, economic, and even spiritual life. Clara now walks there twice a week, her visits more frequent as they prepare to stock enough loaves for the long days of work and the cold nights that approach. The link between the individual and the collective reveals itself in the ritual of baking. When Clara arrives, she finds not only Etienne, her neighbor, but also Théodore, the village blacksmith, and Bertrande, the midwife. The mingled sounds of their voices and the crackling wood that feeds the flames form a rustic symphony, the music of community. The sight of firelit faces, their skin flushed from heat, glowing against the soot-darkened walls, speaks of unity born from necessity. Though each pays the banality tax to the feudal lord, they share warmth, time, and the waiting. Geneviève, who has joined Clara today to oversee the quality of the bread, uses the moment to share one of her many lessons, this one about the strange dual nature of the oven. The right to bake bread privately, she explains, was often denied to peasants. Lords held monopolies over mills, presses and ovens, forcing the poor to pay for their use in grain or labor. The communal oven is therefore both a symbol of unity and oppression, a hearth of fellowship underlined by the shadow of servitude. The scent that hangs in the air is thick and complex, a mix of smoke, yeast and millet bread, browning in the flames. Millet, the poor man's grain, yields loaves dense and coarse, less nourishing than barley or rye, but still precious. Clara feels the rough wicker of the basket in her hands, its texture biting lightly against her palms, while the cool softness of the dough beneath the cloth contrasts with the dryness of the autumn wind. As the loaves bake, Geneviève tells one of her small, tender stories, this one about charity in times of famine. In the hardest years, she says, the church and nearby monasteries gave out soups of lentils and bread, so coarse it was called panis militaris, the soldier's bread. Yet, she adds, true sustenance never came from institutions or tithes. It came from neighborly kindness, from one hand quietly helping another. Her own small acts, sharing herbs from her secret garden with Etienne or Barnabé, carry on that ancient unspoken tradition. Clara studies Théodore, the blacksmith, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees. His loaf, made of dark millet, is small and hard, a reflection of his family's poverty. Around him, laughter and chatter soften the edge of social divisions. Here, in the furnace's glow, every person is equal before the fire, united by hunger, heat, and time. When Clara passes her hand along the oven's stone wall, the heat radiates through her fingertips, dry, steady, alive. It's the kind of warmth that soaks deep into bone, warding off the chill of approaching frost. Geneviève places her palm on the same stone and reminds her that good bread demands patience. The crust, she says, must protect the soul of the bread, the crumb. It's both lesson and metaphor. Endurance requires the same strength, the same balance between toughness and tenderness. They watch the flames dance behind the iron door, the air alive with the hiss of steam and the low murmur of voices. The bread, as it rises and darkens, carries the scent of home into the square. For the villagers, it's more than food. It's proof of continuity, a rhythm older than memory. When the loaves are finally drawn out, the sound of the peels scraping the oven floor echoes like applause. The air fills with a wave of fragrance, smoke, grain and warmth combined. Clara helps stack the golden brown discs into her basket, their crusts hard and beautiful, their heat radiating through the wicker. Around her, others do the same, nodding and smiling in mutual acknowledgement of work well done. As they leave, the evening light stretches long across the village paths. Smoke from the oven's chimney drifts slowly upward, curling into the grey sky. The day's labour has ended, but its rewards, warmth, sustenance, solidarity, linger like embers in the heart. Back in the cabin, the basket rests on the table between them. Geneviève takes a knife, its handle smooth from years of use, and cuts through a loaf. The crisp crack of the crust breaking fills the room, followed by the faint sigh of steam escaping. The pure sound of nourishment. The bread's scent is intoxicating. Clara takes a piece and tastes the faint, spicy note of mustard she added to the dough, a whisper of her own growing confidence. It's strong, rustic, slightly smoky and wonderfully alive. Geneviève nods approvingly, and for a moment the hard months ahead seem lighter. They eat their bread in silence, letting the warmth of the hearth and the satisfaction of provision settle over them. For peasants, Geneviève reminds her, bread is more than food. It is the body of their labour, the measure of their endurance, the soul of their home. Later, as the night draws near, Clara sits by the fire, holding one of the loaves close to her chest to keep it warm. The coarse texture of its crust against her skin is strangely comforting. In it, she feels the strength of her grandmother, the bond of her neighbours, the echo of the village itself. Geneviève tidies the table, humming softly, her movements deliberate and calm. The rhythm of her gestures, folding the cloth, covering the loaves, closing the shutters, feels like the conclusion of a prayer. Each act is small, but together they bind the day in quiet completion. Outside, the faint hum of voices fades as other villagers return home with their baskets. The oven, still glowing in the dark, stands as a sentinel of warmth against the growing cold, a reminder that even under the weight of taxes and toil, there exists a kind of sacred fellowship born from shared fire. Clara lies down later, the smell of bread still clinging to her hands. She closes her eyes and imagines the oven's flames flickering in the night, their light dancing on familiar faces. That vision lulls her to sleep, a portrait of resilience, community, and the humble, sustaining miracle of bread. The final sound before she drifts off is the faint crackle of crust cooling in the basket, a fragile yet enduring music of peace. In that quiet moment, the village breathes as one, its heart beating softly in the glow of its common fire. The expansion of daily life now stretches beyond the warmth of the communal oven to the small stream running along the edge of the village, a silver thread of movement in a landscape otherwise preparing for sleep. It is here that the peasants gather for another task essential to their collective survival, washing their clothes, and more importantly, preparing certain foods that require the purity of running water. Clara and Geneviève walk there at dawn, the cold air biting at their faces. The sound of the rushing stream cuts through the stillness of the fields, a sharp, crystalline music that speaks both of life and endurance. The touch of wet, slippery stones beneath their feet demands balance and care. Clara feels the chill seeping through her wooden clogs, while Genevieve bends over the water to wash the thick roots of burdock she harvested the day before. The earth, clinging to the roots, releases easily under the current, swirling away in muddy ribbons. The grandmother explains that cold water cleans best, its movement doing what human strength alone cannot. "You must read the current," she says softly, "as you read the soil. The water has moods too." The stream's flow, glittering under the low sun, becomes a symbol of purification. Around them the air smells of iron, moss, and raw earth. The sound of splashing hands, the rhythmic swish of roots rubbing against stone, and the murmur of Genevieve's instructions blend into a kind of meditative music. Clara, kneeling beside her, helps scrub the roots clean. The icy water numbs her fingers, but the nearness of her grandmother, radiating warmth and calm authority, steadies her. The work is cold but purposeful, a ritual of continuity. Genevieve, sensing her granddaughter's quiet thoughts, begins to speak about the life hidden in water. She explains that while hunting was forbidden to the poor, fishing in local streams and ponds offered them one of their few reliable sources of protein. Small freshwater fish, perch, carp, or eels, were caught with woven traps or spears, eaten fresh on fasting days, or salted and dried for winter. For the peasants, the stream is not just a place of washing, it is a living pantry, a source of both nourishment and renewal. Clara looks at the clear water running over the dark roots. She sees how the current transforms everything it touches, softening, polishing, revealing. Her grandmother's words echo within her. That cleanliness, even of simple things, is an act of respect for life. In a world where disease lurks in dirt and decay, washing vegetables becomes a prayer for health and gratitude. The scent around them is unlike any other, sharp from the cold, earthy from the roots, faintly metallic from the stones. It is the smell of winter's threshold. Clara's breath rises in pale clouds, and when Genevieve straightens her back with a sigh, the steam from the water clings to her wool shawl like a veil of mist. As they finish, Genevieve places the washed roots carefully into a woven basket lined with dry straw. "Tomorrow they'll dry by the hearth," she says, "and when the frost comes, we'll be ready." Her tone carries the calm pride of someone who knows that foresight is the truest form of strength. While they rest for a moment, Genevieve shares another small story, this one about the philosophy of sharing that sustains the village through its hardest months. She recalls winters so harsh that even the church's granaries ran low. Yet survival, she says, did not depend on charity alone, but on the quiet generosity of neighbors who shared seeds, herbs, or roots. It was this invisible web of kindness, not sermons or taxes, that held the village together. Clara listens, her hands cupped around a small flask of weak ale to warm them. The drink is sour and smoky, but comforting. She imagines the world as her grandmother describes it, a place where strength is measured not by wealth, but by what one is willing to give. By midday, they begin the slow walk back to the cabin. The basket is heavy, but the rhythm of their steps feels peaceful. Behind them, the sound of the stream continues, a soft, eternal murmur that will outlast them both. When they return home, the cold has deepened, and the sky carries the dull glow of early dusk. The cabin smells faintly of old wood and smoke. Genevieve hangs the roots near the fire to dry, their dark skins gleaming in the flickering light. The scent that fills the room, earthy and faintly sweet, is the perfume of preparedness, of nature preserved through care. That evening their soup is rich and hearty, a broth of burdock roots and a small piece of salted pork fat. The flavor is deep, earthy and warm, a perfect antidote to the creeping chill outside. Genevieve says that winter food must be bold and nourishing. When the days are short, taste must be long. As they eat, Clara feels the warmth of the soup spreading through her body, the fatigue of the day dissolving into a gentle calm. She glances toward the window, where the last light fades into blue-grey shadows. When night settles, the wind begins its low song around the cabin, slipping through cracks in the wood. The fire glows softly, and Genevieve's voice, quiet, rhythmic, returns once more. The water that runs through our village is the same that fed our mother's fields. It remembers us, even when we forget to look. Later, as Clara lies under her blanket, she imagines the stream beneath the moonlight, running steady and cold, carrying life through the frozen earth. Its sound, faint and ceaseless, seems to flow through her dreams, a lullaby older than words. The final image that holds her before sleep is of the water gliding past smooth stones, reflecting the stars. It is the image of movement and renewal, of life that endures and adapts. In that serene vision, the hardships of the medieval world dissolve, leaving only rhythm, light, and the quiet assurance that nature and hope never cease to flow. With the colder days settling in, and the earth already resting beneath its winter blanket, village life enters a phase of quiet pause. The rhythm slows, the focus shifts from the outer fields to the inner warmth of the home. Clara's world contracts gently to the small space of the cabin and to her grandmother Genevieve, who spends her days spinning wool and weaving small patchwork rugs near the hearth. Each movement of her hands, measured, patient, is both meditation and preservation, a ritual of endurance against the approaching cold. The hearth becomes the heart of their world. The fire burns brighter and longer now, its glow painting the rough walls in waves of amber and shadow. Genevieve sits on a low stool, her face illuminated by the flickering light. The steady hum of the spindle turning wool into thread fills the air, a sound so rhythmic it feels like breathing. It's the music of patience, of quiet labor that keeps life moving even when the fields sleep. The texture of the wool between Clara's fingers is warm and coarse, comforting in its rawness. She helps card the fibers, loosening them into soft clouds before her grandmother's deft hands draw them into fine strands. Genevieve reminds her that wool, though rough and prickly, is their truest ally against the cold. Every thread spun, she says, is a promise of warmth. To Clara, that truth feels like magic, the power to turn the harshness of nature into protection. As they work, Genevieve shares one of her quiet reflections on the customs of winter. She explains that, in the villages of her youth, no one endured the cold alone. Neighbors without wood or the elderly often slept beside another's fire, welcomed without question. To share heat was to share life. Food warms the body for an hour, she says softly, but the hearth warms the heart all night. The air inside the cabin grows thick with comforting scents, oak smoke from the fire, the faint musk of lanolin from freshly spun wool, and the gentle sweetness of drying onions and garlic hanging in braids from the rafters. To Genevieve, these are not only ingredients, but guardians of health. Garlic and onion, she reminds Clara, keep away sickness and bad air. In her voice, the old superstition carries a kind of ancient wisdom, half faith, half science, entirely survival. Clara mends a tear in her grandmother's shawl, the needle flashing briefly in the firelight. The work demands stillness and focus, her body warmed by the fire's radiance while the cold presses faintly against the cabin walls. In this slowness, she discovers a peace she hadn't noticed before, a rhythm made of silence and purpose. She begins to understand what her grandmother means when she speaks of winter not as death, but as a time of waiting, of learning endurance. Outside, the wind moans low across the frozen fields, but inside, the fire's steady crackle holds the world together. Genevieve begins to tell a story, her voice hushed yet vivid. It is a tale she's told 100 times, of saints who healed the sick, of knights who vanished into forests, of fairies who whispered wisdom in dreams. In these long, dark months, storytelling is their light. Without books or candles to spare, words become their warmth, carrying memory and wonder from one generation to the next. Clara listens, her eyes fixed on the flames. Each story flickers like the fire itself, bright for a moment, then fading, only to rise again. She imagines the same scene repeated across the village, families huddled by the glow, weaving myths to keep fear and silence away. When the story ends, Geneviève ties off a skein of newly spun yarn. She holds it up to the firelight, soft, pale, and shining faintly like spun moonlight. "See," she says, smiling, "even the roughest wool can become something beautiful if you give it time." To Clara, that ball of yarn is more than thread. It's proof of transformation, of turning hardship into warmth. The fire pops gently, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. The shadows on the wall dance like spirits in slow motion. Clara feels the weight of the day soften. Her body relaxes into the rhythm of the fire, the whisper of wool, the hum of her grandmother's song. Outside, winter tightens its hold, but inside the cabin, warmth and peace endure. In that soft glow, the world seems simple again, woven together by patience, love, and the steady hands of a woman who has learned how to turn time itself into shelter. Geneviève devotes her days to preparing tanned sheepskins, soft, thick pelts used as blankets and insulation once the spun wool proves insufficient against the biting cold. She shows Clara how dense yet supple the hides are, running her fingers along the woolly surface that still holds its natural warmth, a small miracle in a world of stone floors and frozen air. The soft rasp of a dull blade scraping against the hide fills the cabin, a rhythmic whisper of foresight and defense against winter's advance. As she works, Geneviève explains to Clara the peasant's humble art of insulation. Most cottages, she says, were built from wattle and daub, mud mixed with straw, or from rough timber. Their survival depended on organic ingenuity. Dried straw was often stuffed between the beams of the roof, while thick linen curtains or animal skins were hung over doors and windows to keep the warmth of the hearth from escaping. Many windows were sealed not with glass, but with stretched animal membranes or oiled paper, dim yet practical barriers against the wind. Every layer, every stitch was a quiet act of preservation. The cabin's air grows heavier, layered with scents both familiar and raw. The sweetness of oak smoke, the musk of wool, and the sharp, salty tang of fresh sheepskin drying near the hearth's dying glow. Clara feels the waves of heat rising from the fire, her daily refuge from the creeping cold. She watches her grandmother bent over her work, illuminated by the amber light. The sight is one of endurance, of a woman who knows that survival is not a matter of strength alone, but of patience and preparation. As she scrapes the hide, Geneviève shares a small piece of everyday history. Proper footwear, she says, was a luxury few peasants could afford. Most wore simple leather shoes, patched and repatched through the seasons, or wooden clogs, sabots, sturdy but miserably cold. To protect themselves, people wrapped their feet in layers of woolen cloth before slipping them into their shoes, trapping what little warmth they could. You could tell a family's hardship, she says, by how many times their feet were wrapped before dawn. Then, in her quiet storytelling tone, Geneviève recalls a terrible winter long ago, when snow fell so heavily that the village vanished under its own silence for weeks. No travelers, no markets, no contact with the world beyond the valley. What saved them, she says, were the jars of pickled vegetables stored the autumn before, and the healing ointments her own grandmother made from animal fat and herbs, salves that soothed frost-bitten skin and kept the sick alive. It's a story of fear, yes, but also of resilience, a reminder that wisdom passed down is the truest form of hope. The cabin is hushed, the only sounds the scrape of leather and the faint sigh of wind outside. Clara becomes aware of her own breathing, slow and deep, mingling with the heartbeat of the fire. She threads a heavy needle and begins stitching small patches of hide together. The task demands effort. Each puncture through the thick leather requires strength and resolve, but with every pull of the thread, she transforms something raw into comfort. The texture under her fingertips changes as the seams tighten, rough edges smoothing into order. The smell of cured skin, smoke, and wool fills her senses, grounding her in the reality of work that sustains. She understands now that even stillness in winter is not idleness. It is preparation written in fabric, in fire, in patience. At last, Genevieve rises and tosses a handful of dried apple peels into the hearth. They sizzle briefly before releasing a faintly sweet fragrance, a ghost of summer preserved in scent. The air softens, the sweetness mingles with the smoke, wrapping the room in calm remembrance. She smiles at Clara and says gently, "It's not the walls or the fire that keep us alive, my dear. It's knowing what to do with what we have, and loving it enough to care." The words settle in the air like a prayer. Clara leans back, the warmth of the fire brushing her face, and watches the flames lick the iron grate. The flickering light dances across the wool and hides, turning their coarse surfaces golden. In that quiet glow, she feels the meaning of her grandmother's lesson. That simplicity, when lived with tenderness and skill, becomes strength. As night deepens, the fire hums low, and the scent of apple, wool, and smoke lulls her toward rest. The rhythm of Genevieve's movements, folding, tidying, adjusting the hides by the fire, becomes the pulse of peace itself. Clara drifts to sleep with the image of her grandmother's hands in motion, steady and certain, shaping warmth out of what the world gives. The last sound she hears is the soft crackle of burning wood, a quiet, living heartbeat in the heart of winter. With winter now fully settled, snow blankets the valley in silence, shifting our gaze toward the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Rémy, nestled among the hills like an island of order and plenty amid the peasant world's fragile struggle for survival. In this 13th century setting, the focus turns from Clara, the villager of scarcity, to Brother Anselm, keeper of the monastery's cellar and storerooms, a man in his 50s, broad-handed, practical, with sharp eyes that miss nothing among the provisions entrusted to his care. His life is not one of sowing, but of safeguarding. Each morning, lantern in hand, Anselma descends into the cool stone corridors of the cellars to inspect the great reserves of grain, cheese, wine, and salted meat that will sustain the monks through months of isolation. The only sound that breaks the monastic stillness is the faint, rhythmic creak of his oil lantern's handle as he walks, echoing softly off the damp walls like a heartbeat of diligence. The new sensory world he inhabits is rich and layered. The air is thick with the sweet, heady scent of fermenting wine and ale, aging in oak barrels, the dense, savory aroma of cured cheese hanging from the rafters, and the dry, comforting smell of sacks filled with pure wheat, a grain Clara's people rarely touch. The cold, moist touch of the stone beneath his fingertips reminds him of the constant battle against dampness and vermin, the silent adversaries of preservation. From this vantage point, history reveals one of its quieter truths, the superiority of monastic life when it came to nourishment and innovation. The Benedictines were pioneers of medieval agriculture, cultivating hardier strains of grain, mastering irrigation, and refining the making of beer and wine, beverages safer than water itself. The abbey, with its walled gardens and vast granaries, stands as a fortress of stability in an age ruled by famine and uncertainty. Brother Anselm pauses before the ceramic jars that line a long wooden table, each filled with fruits and vegetables preserved in honey or vinegar, a luxury afforded only by the monastery's wealth of land and the steady tribute of the peasants' tithes. The sight of golden pears and jewel-toned plums glistening in syrup contrasts sharply with the thin vegetable broth of Clara's village. The imagined taste, sweet, tart and concentrated, is, to Anselm, both reward and reminder, the sweetness of labor sanctified by prayer. A brief parallel memory surfaces as he inspects the jars. He recalls the winter a starving young peasant crept into the abbey grounds and was caught trying to steal from the cellar. Instead of reporting him, Anselm gave the boy a round loaf of bread and a small flask of ale, an act of mercy done in secret. The monastery, he reflects, may symbolize discipline and control, but it also bears the burden of compassion, its abundance meant not only for monks, but for the desperate souls who live beyond its gates. Finishing his inspection, Anselm kneels before a small wooden image of Saint Benedict set into an alcove by the door. He lights a small oil lamp in offering, and the faint hiss of the flame fills the space with warmth and gratitude. The soft, clean scent of burning olive oil rises and mingles with the rich fragrance of grain and wine. He whispers a prayer of thanks, not only for the provisions that fill the shelves, but for the fragile balance between austerity and generosity that sustains the world beyond the cloister. When he leaves, the lantern's light flickers down the corridor, illuminating the smooth curve of stone and the quiet promise of fullness behind every sealed door. Later, lying in his narrow cell, Brother Anselm feels the chill of the stone beneath his bed and the calm assurance of duty fulfilled. The abbey and the village that depends on it will endure another winter. Brother Anselm's new perspective unfolds in the kitchen of Saint-Remy Abbey, a vast, orderly space that reveals the striking difference between monastic and peasant diets. The inspector monk walks among the long oak tables where fresh vegetables, turnips and cabbages, and dried ones, peas and lentils, are sorted for the daily meals. His senses are filled with the sharp, pungent smell of onions and garlic being peeled and chopped by silent novices, a fragrance both strong and comforting, the prelude to the thick, hearty soups that form the backbone of monastic life. Even on fasting days, when meat is forbidden, these broths remain vital, nourishing the body as prayer nourishes the soul. The smooth texture of the oak work tables, polished by years of use and cleaning, contrasts with the chill of the stone floor beneath his sandals. Anselm oversees the store of pure wheat flour, kept in sealed barrels. The sight of that fine white powder is a symbol of privilege and plenty, the opposite of the dark, coarse barley and rye bread of the village. He remembers that white flour was often reserved for baking the holy hosts and for the priests' and abbots' tables, while the humbler, whole-grain meal fed the lay brothers, a quiet hierarchy of food that existed even within the church's own walls. A small historical truth reveals itself through his inspection of the stores, the importance of the monastery's walled garden, or hortus. Unlike the open village fields, it was cultivated with advanced botanical knowledge, ensuring a constant and varied supply of herbs, vegetables, and even a few rare fruits. Anselm studies the bundles of thyme, parsley, and sage, hanging high to dry, safe from moisture. He can almost taste the rich, complex flavor they'll lend to the lentil stew, a reward born of order and discipline. A brief parallel memory surfaces in his mind, the monastic custom of hospitality. By Benedictine rule, the abbey was obliged to receive and feed the poor and passing pilgrims. One winter, he personally oversaw the distribution of salted fish broth and rye bread, a gesture of charity that strained the reserves but fulfilled a sacred duty. That moment, he recalls, stood in quiet contrast to the self-preserving hunger that scarcity often breeds in villages beyond the walls, a reminder that faith sustains generosity even in hardship. The monk walks down to the cellar, where the heavy scent of wine and olive oil, luxuries imported for cooking and for the church lamps, fills the air. He inspects the barrels of wine, which everyone in the community drinks, diluted with water, safer and more nourishing than the river's supply. The soft, bubbling sound of the slow fermentation hums through the room, a steady rhythm of life hidden beneath stone. When Anselmo returns to his cell, the warmth of his body against the cold stone soothes him. He lies down in silence, the order and quiet abundance of the larder still vivid in his mind, a symbol of stability and faith in a fragile world. His final, gentle reflection drifts like a prayer that true wealth lies not in what one keeps, but in the grace to preserve and share what the earth and God provide, a quiet lesson in prudence and charity. Clara's village now lies fully under the rule of winter, and life turns inward. The community, confined to its cabins, relies on sounds and smells to stay connected and to survive. The central element of this phase is smoke, not merely a byproduct of the hearth, but a vehicle for communication, warmth, and most crucially, food preservation. The scent of oak smoke, the most efficient firewood, and peat mingles with the salty, heavy aroma of cured pork and fish, when such treasures can be obtained, hanging from the rafters to be smoked. It's a technique that keeps meat edible through the cold months and infuses it with depth, the true flavor of winter. The heightened sensory richness of this season reveals itself in sound, now muted and softened by snow. The most important noise is the creak of earthen jars being opened and closed, the sound of accessing precious provisions. When Clara reaches up to take a piece of smoked pork from the beam, the feel beneath her fingers is dry, salted, and faintly sticky with fat, a tactile promise of stored energy, vital for the tasks she still performs indoors, like grinding barley for porridge. Geneviève demonstrates a curious medieval custom of storage. She explains that it was common to hang smoked meats and bundles of garlic near the ceiling, where the air was drier and warmer thanks to the hearth smoke, and where they were safe from rats. The sight of the cabin, with these treasures suspended from dark, smoke-stained beams, forms a vertical pantry, an ingenious system of preservation and space optimization through smoke. The story the grandmother shares is of a past winter, when the smoke from her hearth was the only light that guided their neighbor Barnaby, lost in a blizzard, back home to safety. Smoke, though it stings the eyes and clings to clothing, is also the beacon of the community, a visual and olfactory signal that life still burns beneath the snow, a metaphor for hope made visible through the quiet endurance of the warm home. The gentle warmth of the fire, mingling with the thick, smoky air, gives Clara a physical sense of refuge. She turns to her essential task, grinding barley in the stone mill. The subtle, steady motion of her arm and the soft, dry rasp of the grinding stone form the rhythm of her days. The transformation of grain into flour, the ongoing act that ensures bread and porridge for the coming morning. The taste of the soup, now richer and more concentrated, with the smoky fat of cured pork and the sharpness of dried herbs, is the taste of preserved winter itself, a complex harmony of salt, smoke, and earth, the reward for foresight and steady labor. Geneviève insists that winter food must be dense and hot, nourishing the body's inner fire against the vast cold outside, a lesson in seasonal survival through nourishment and wisdom. Clara watches her grandmother spinning wool under the dim light of the hearth. The final poetic image is of the smoke, rising softly from the chimney and dissolving into the grey sky, the invisible sign that the fire, the heart of the community, still burns, and that life and hope persist. Inside the cabin, beneath the heavy mantle of winter, one sense becomes vital for a peasant woman managing her provisions: smell. Geneviève insists that the scent of the pantry is her truest measure of food security. A sour or overly sharp odor means the vegetable brine has failed, while the musty smell of mold signals that the grains or bread are spoiled, warnings that call for swift action. With her nose trained by years of experience, the grandmother can judge the health of her stores, even with her eyes closed. A sensory wisdom essential for preventing waste and illness. The feel of wool and sheepskin covering the cot is the only warmth Clara feels upon waking, a brief comfort before the bite of the frozen air rising from the earthen floor. She moves toward the hearth, feeling the sting of cold prick her skin before the soft, dry heat of rekindled embers embraces her. The crisp, resonant crack of oak logs laid upon the fire is the sound of luxury and security, for this noble wood burns longer and produces a cleaner smoke. The curious medieval custom her grandmother shares today is the making of bread soups, an ingenious way to stretch the grain supply. She explains that when bread grew old and hard, it was never wasted but sliced and soaked in water, broth or wine, the original soppa, meaning soaked bread. This simple practical method revived stale loaves, added flavor, and made digestion easier, ensuring that not a single crumb of grain went unused in their subsistence economy. Their neighbor Barnabé finally visits the cabin to thank Geneviève for sharing her herbs and broad beans at the beginning of winter. In return, he brings a small piece of salted sheep's cheese, a humble yet meaningful gift. His gesture, offered by a man hardened by labor and silence, is an act of solidarity expressed in the only currency the poor truly value: food. The sharp, tangy taste of the cheese that Clara and Geneviève share together carries the flavor of gratitude, community, and quiet hope. The slow, gentle rhythm of the grandmother's work, mending clothes by the firelight, fills the cabin with peace. The soft, rhythmic puncture of the needle through thick cloth becomes a melody of perseverance and care. The sight of the hearth, its flames dancing beneath the smoked bacon hanging from the beams, forms an image of refuge and security in the midst of a white, endless winter landscape where snow is the only horizon. Geneviève reminds Clara that the subtle stillness of peasant life in winter is, in truth, a labor of conservation and inner preparation. The body and spirit feed on rest, patience, and quiet work. She tells her granddaughter that waiting for the snow to melt is as vital as having the strength to plow the soil, a poetic reflection on nature's rhythm and the cyclical wisdom of life itself. Before sleep, Clara watches her grandmother toss a handful of dried sage into the embers. The aromatic medicinal scent spreads softly through the cabin, a perfume of purification and protection against the bad airs of the night. It is both an act of faith and of ancient wisdom, wrapping them in calm and safety. The room grows quiet, and the two women drift into rest as the snow falls unseen outside, while the faint scent of sage and smoke lingers, a lullaby of warmth, endurance, and belonging. The harshness of winter has reached its peak, a season balanced between resignation and a tense stillness, as the limits of their provisions are tested and the uncertain promise of thaw lingers like a faraway rumor. The world outside lies frozen, unmoving, and inside the cabin all attention centers on the careful management of their grain reserves, the true pillar of survival, watched over by Geneviève with the quiet discipline of someone repeating a centuries-old ritual of prudence. The light inside the cabin is pale and scarce. Clara's eyes adapt to the dimness, where the stacked sacks of barley and rye in the driest corner have become the horizon of her hope. The air smells of stored grain and faint smoke, a dry, earthy scent that to her is the perfume of endurance, the essence of life preserved. With silent wisdom, Genevieve begins the day's inventory, less an accounting than a soft-spoken ritual of reassurance. She counts the handfuls of grain left, matching them to the number of days until spring. It is arithmetic turned prayer, her voice murmuring a mantra of prudence as the grains slip between her fingers. The dry, rhythmic sound of kernels falling into the pot is the rhythm of survival itself. The grandmother tells Clara that the story of winter never changes, the temptation to eat too much early, followed by hunger at the end. Strength, she says, isn't in what we eat, but in what we save. The dark, rough bread, though thinner now, is their most faithful ally against hunger, a daily lesson in restraint and foresight. When Clara presses her hands against the sacks, she feels their cool, coarse surface. Her touch carries both care and responsibility. The faint warmth spreading from her own body comes from the oat porridge she ate that morning, a humble source of strength that keeps her steady for the long day of tending the hearth and home. Their diet shifts gradually with the season's grip. The soup has grown thinner, more water, fewer legumes. But the herbs Genevieve dried in summer still lend it grace. Thyme and sage, traces of green in a colorless world. Spice, the old woman says, is hope. It turns water into food and survival into gratitude. Clara listens and stirs the pot, feeling the wooden spoons scrape softly against the clay. The aroma that rises is faint, yet soothing, a reminder that even in scarcity the senses can still be fed. Later that day, as she divides their evening meal, Clara quietly fills a small bowl with porridge and sets it aside. She carries it through the snow to Barnaby's cabin, where faint smoke rises weakly from the chimney. Without a word, she leaves it by the door, knowing he will understand. When she returns, her fingers are numb, but her chest feels warm with something stronger than fire. The small act of giving has become its own hearth. Genevieve, having noticed her absence, says nothing, only smiles, her eyes glimmering in the dim light. She resumes spinning wool, and the soft whir of the spindle becomes the lullaby of the cabin, a rhythm as steady as breathing, the sound of endurance made tangible. The fire burns low, casting a red glow across Genevieve's calm face. The faint crackle of wood, the scent of ash, and the whisper of wool create a harmony of quiet survival. The world beyond their walls no longer seems hostile, only distant. Clara settles beneath the sheepskins, her limbs heavy with fatigue, but her mind at peace. She thinks of Barnaby's family, perhaps now warmed by the same act of generosity that sustains her own heart. The wind sighs outside, carrying with it the sound of shifting snow. Each gust feels like the earth breathing beneath its icy shroud, a slow rhythm promising renewal. Genevieve closes her eyes and murmurs, "Winter tests what we've learned, not what we have." Her words drift into the air like smoke, settling somewhere deep in Clara's memory. The young woman stares at the last ember glowing in the hearth, shrinking but stubborn, refusing to die. It mirrors her grandmother's spirit and her own. That night, the silence feels deeper than usual, yet not empty. It is the silence of things waiting, the seeds under the soil, the water frozen mid-flow, the heart steady beneath the weight of cold. When Clara finally falls asleep, her dreams are soft and colorless, shaped by the scent of smoke and barley. In her dream, the snow begins to melt, not suddenly but gently, drop by drop. The fire breathes once more, a slow pulse of warmth in the stillness, and within that fragile light, both women rest. Their world, though frozen, remains alive. And outside, under the snow, the earth listens, holding the secret promise of spring. The shift in the cold climate and the resulting change in peasant routine deepens their dependence on underground resources. The narrative now centers on the storage of wild cassava root, or skirret, a common medieval root crop, a hidden reserve of carbohydrates and the family's emergency food supply. Grandmother Geneviève devotes herself to cleaning and preparing these roots, harvested just before the earth froze solid. Her work becomes a quiet ritual of repetition, reinforcing the wisdom of secret reserves. The pale daylight filtering into the cabin falls upon the knotted, ghostly roots, a visual reminder of how fragile their sustenance truly is. The smell of cassava, earthy and faintly bitter, fills the air, a scent of necessity that contrasts with the richer aroma of the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It's a balance between hardship and comfort, survival and solace. The texture of the roots, which Clara helps scrape and chop into small pieces, is rough and cold. The dry, sharp sound of the iron knife striking wood becomes the rhythm of their preparation for the uncertain days ahead. Geneviève insists the cooking must be slow and patient to remove the root's natural acidity, a culinary act of endurance that transforms the inedible into nourishment. With her calm, steady tone, Geneviève tells Clara the small human story of this survival route. In times of war or famine, it was often the only thing peasants had to chew on, a meager source of fullness that kept life going. She teaches that the value of food lies not in its taste, but in its power to sustain and preserve life, a lesson in pragmatism and resilience. The gradual change in their diet becomes clear with the addition of cassava root. It's grated and mixed into the oat porridge, thickening it into something heavier and more filling. The taste is dense and slightly earthy, but Clara enhances it with a pinch of wild onion and dried garlic, her grandmother's teaching turned into flavor. It's a quiet victory of creativity over scarcity. Geneviève watches her granddaughter closely, and through gentle repetition reminds her of another rule: to sip the weak beer slowly throughout the day. It provides not just calories, but safe hydration in a world where water can sicken. The faint bubbling sound from the small barrel under the bed is the soft murmur of liquid survival. The slow variation of this day reveals itself in Geneviève's gesture. Instead of spinning wool, she tends to their gardening tools, tightening handles, sharpening small blades. The cool touch of wood and the smooth scrape of metal against the whetstone are her quiet preparations for spring, a labor of faith disguised as maintenance. Clara sits near the fire, wrapped in warmth, watching her grandmother work. The sight feels like a mirror of her own life, a cycle of repairing and persevering, of tending to what is broken so it might last another season. The act of fixing becomes a metaphor for the soul's endurance. As